All right, everybody. How you doing? This is Jay Stephen here. So somebody asked me to clarify this question, and the issue is, what was it that made Richard the Lionheart, Richard the First of England, such a brilliant general? Well, I want to go through some of the points that deal with this issue right now and clarify it. So, if you take a look at the career of Richard the First of England, if you look at his campaigns as a young man before he became king, if you look at his war with Saladin during the Crusades, if you look at his later campaigns against Philip II of France, it's just very obvious that Richard was one of the great military minds of his era. And, you know, especially if you're looking at the rest of what was going on with medieval warfare during the High Middle Ages and beyond. I mean, I think that the fact is he really stands out just in military history, period, not just in the medieval era. So, okay, so the Victorians had this mistaken belief that Richard the Lionheart was a dashing fighter, that he was good in the actual combat, hand-to-hand combat, just fighting in the field. He was a great knight, but he was a poor administrator. And this is just not true. This is just crazy. But this is because the Victorians really just did not know very much about the Middle Ages. Their scholarship was crap. We understand the medieval world far better than them. But yeah, this is based on a misunderstanding of both Richard's career and his what actually happened in his career, because you have to actually be ignorant of the facts of his career to hold that idea. But also, it's a misunderstanding of the era itself. Like the Victorians had this silly idea that there was no military strategy in the Middle Ages, that it was just like a bunch of guys running around with axes hitting each other. And back in the Roman times, they had advanced military strategy, and we Victorians today have it. But God, those medievals, they were just a bunch of barbarians hitting each other with clubs, And of course, we know that this isn't true. This is a crazy idea. We know, scholars will tell you now that medieval military strategy was just as complicated as that found in any era. So this is just a misunderstanding of the medieval world. And also, if you think about this on a deeper level, Richard the Lionheart, over the course of his career, won, far more battles than your average medieval ruler even fought. I mean, pitched battles were a rare thing. Richard the Lionheart fought quite a few of them, and he won them. And he conducted successful military campaigns in a multiple of theaters, Palestine, France, and he did very well. You can't do that by just being a good, boxer, by just being a guy who's good with a sword. You do that by being a good administrator. I mean, it's as simple as that, because the work of a general, the responsibilities that he has and what he has to do to achieve success, this requires administrative talent. This is not just like, I can swing a sword better than anybody else. I'm the best with sword play. I mean, that's crazy. So, okay. So yeah, Richard the Lionheart was a highly capable general, and he was a very intelligent general. His career shows that. He's up there with the great military minds in military history. So why? Why is that? How do we know that? And what was it about him that made him this way? Well, again, he was an excellent administrator. He organized and made use of resources wisely. We think about the sort of resources he had to gather and organize for the Third Crusade, the sort of planning he had to make. He had extensive lands in both France and England that had to be organized before he left. And once he was actually in Palestine and, dealing with a hostile enemy force pretty much constantly shadowing him, and a situation that was very difficult for morale, he was able to effectively disperse and make use of resources to keep his army well supplied and keeping the men fed, that kind of thing. The march down Arsuf, he governed men well and put the right people in the right positions. The way he organized the army as it was marching down the Palestinian coast after they'd conquered Acre and, leading up to the Battle of Arsuf. We think about the organization of the campaign to capture Cyprus. Cyprus is a very difficult conquest. Lots and lots of powers have had trouble conquering Cyprus. Richard was able to do it with a very, for example, just the first initial assault on Cyprus, this amphibious assault he executed was, there are very few campaigns that have that kind of, amphibious campaigns like that, especially during this era, that could go over that well. And he was facing some serious resistance too. There's this idea that, Cyprus was just kind of a pushover. That's not true. I think another thing that Richard the Lionheart had was an unusual ability to assess a situation. He put his army into situations that he knew would result in a good outcome, that would result in their victory. He was very good at planning his campaigns and looking ahead at what was going to happen and the potential for what was going to happen. I think Richard the Lionheart was the kind of commander who, for example, we look at the march down the Palestinian coast. This was something that he envisioned in his mind, how it was going to go, this movement from Acre to Jaffa. He understood how it was going to play out and, what the potential risks were. He understood the type of pressure that Saladin was going to bring to bear on him. And so he organized things in a way that were going to make that march effective and prevent Saladin from taking advantage of his advantages, because Saladin had every advantage in that situation. He didn't have any kind of army behind him pressing on him. He had the advantage of being on the home court. He had a plentiful amount of men that he could draw on from his various territories, and there's just no reason that he shouldn't have been able to drive to stop the advance of this small Crusader army down the Palestinian coast. Why wasn't he able to do that? It was because of the way Richard organized the march. We think about, for one thing, just something like having the infantry march in shifts. Like Richard had, like this was a formation that had been done throughout the history of the Crusader states in the 12th century. It was the idea of having the infantry act as a screen to the cavalry. Well, Richard did that. He had a very close formation for the march. So he had the infantry marching close to the cavalry to provide a screen to the cavalry, but he also had the infantry marching in shifts because they were being harassed by Saladin's army. And so the infantry came under a lot of pressure. So what Richard did was he would have, one set of guys march for a while and fight while they were marching, because it was a fighting march. And then they would switch, and those guys would go onto the inside, more towards the shore, where they were away from the hard fighting. And then the other infantry shift would come out, and they would take their turn, acting as the screen and marching. So, this is brilliant. And then, of course, the close shadowing of his army with his fleet. All of this was organized well in advance. This is the mark of a great administrator who's envisioning how the campaign is going to go and then executing it. And then the Battle of Jaffa, which happened a year later, is another good example of Richard's forward thinking and quick thinking at the same time too. Saladin suddenly, Richard had secured Jaffa the previous year. Well, Saladin suddenly attacks Jaffa and tries to dislodge Richard's garrison from the city. Richard had to react very quickly to this. So what he knew that he needed to get there quickly. And so he had a small force with him. And he understood that if he made a rapid blitz onto the shore of Jaffa, he'd be able to disrupt Saladin's troops. And he knew that once he had established a beachhead, he could defend that beachhead until the relief army, the larger force, which was at Acre and was marching down the coast, arrived to provide relief for him. And there's all kinds of stuff there. But for one thing, his understanding of what his troops were capable of. He knew that with a handful of his guys, he could hold that beachhead until they had the relief that they needed. I think another thing about Richard was that he knew whose advice to take. One thing about Richard, his career, he is a great connoisseur of information. So he was always seeking out the right people to talk to and to get a perspective from in his campaigns. And this is shown in the Third Crusade by he's constantly wanting the right people to advise him. And who was it that he gravitated toward immediately once he was in the Holy Land? It was the Templars and the Hospitallers. From the very start, these were the people whose opinions he took seriously. And this is something that, you can imagine a king, like a medieval king. A medieval king would have had all kinds of people around them who wanted to give them advice, from every corner. This was actually Guy of Lusignan's problem. He was very swayed by whoever was the last person who got a chance to talk to him, And we see this with a lot of kings. There's a lot of kings in history who they took advice from people who they liked or who, had a certain influence over them. Richard the Lionheart took advice from the people who could give him good advice. There were all kinds of people who wanted to give him advice during the Third Crusade. He was listening to the Templars and the Hospitallers. That's really whose opinions he took seriously. And I think that, we think about the Palestine campaign. I think that a guy who's been on some Real Crusades history podcasts before, a scholar who has written quite a bit on medieval politics, Andrew Latham. He did an article where he talked about how, he was convinced that Richard never intended to actually attack Jerusalem, that Richard had decided, even before he got to the Holy Land, that wasn't really a viable target, or at least very soon when he arrived at the Holy Land and was able to assess the situation. That may have been true. Like his idea was that he was going to try to put pressure on Saladin to surrender Jerusalem. And because one thing that's noteworthy about Richard's campaign is he's talking to Saladin, not directly to Saladin, but he has diplomatic exchange going on with Saladin. And especially he meets with Saladin's brother, who is kind of his minister of war, Al-Adil. And one thing that Richard constantly insists on with Al-Adil is, look, you've got to surrender to me the kingdom as it existed prior to the Battle of Hattin. That's what's going to make me stop, fighting you guys. So he brought that diplomatic pressure to bear, and Saladin did the same thing. I mean, Saladin was a brilliant commander himself, so that they both were constantly, doing this diplomatic dance with each other. But that may very well have been the case, that Richard may have. I mean, we know that it's quite clear that once we get into the period where he actually is making some military demonstrations close to Jerusalem, that he pretty much is convinced that he doesn't want to attack Jerusalem. And it's always other voices that are pressing for the attack on Jerusalem. The French nobles, for example, Hugh of Burgundy, and just the common Crusader soldiers wanted this too. Richard never wanted to do it, and I think that's because of his ability to understand situations. And there's another reason for that, and that's also that Richard was unwilling to play games with the lives of his men. Like, he was not the kind of soldier or the kind of general who would just fling his army at a target. He was not willing to see his men just die needlessly. There are some commanders who are like that. I mean, I think if we think of the Battle of Hattin, we've got an example of some commanders who are not thinking that way. But in Richard's case, he just wasn't willing. And that's another thing that's so interesting. The Victorians had this idea that Richard was just like so hot-headed that he would just go into a situation totally boldly without really thinking about it. That's not the case at all. I mean, it's very clear that he shrewdly assessed situations. He was cautious. He conducted campaigns that he knew he could win. And that's why the Third Crusade, I think, is so brilliant, because with the resources he had, he took what territory he could from Saladin. And because of his ability to organize that campaign, Saladin couldn't prevent it. You think about the Third Crusade and what happens. It's kind of ridiculous from Saladin's standpoint. Saladin was one of the greatest Muslim rulers of the era. He was a very talented general himself. And he had, the resources of Egypt and Syria and just this, it was all right there. He was at home. And he can't stop this army from conquering territory on his coast, this small little English army. How come he can't do that? Andrew Ehrenkreuz, in his book about Saladin, discusses this pretty in depth and points out that, this says something about the dynamic of what's going on. I think what Ehrenkreuz misses is he doesn't really talk about what it is about Richard's ability as a commander that makes him able to do this. But anyway, so let's move on to other things about Richard that made him such a great commander. And this is actually my last point. So on top of the fact that he was such a brilliant general, he was a soldier's soldier. So this was kind of the icing on the cake, I think. I mean, everything we've just mentioned is the making of a great military mind. But on top of that, he also was just a great warrior, personally, in the way that, I guess the Victorians thought he was merely, that he was an excellent fighter. He could hold his own in battle. He could fight right there alongside his knights. He had a strong relationship with his men. He had a strong bond with his knights and his men. In part because of that, but also because of what I mentioned earlier, the fact that he was not willing to put them in situations that would be impossible for them to deal with. One of his famous lines that is recorded by the chronicler of the Gesta Regis Ricardi is that he wouldn't ask his men to take a risk that he himself wouldn't also be willing to take. So that right there is the kind of thing that if a general with that attitude, that is the kind of thing that creates good morale in your men. And indeed, Richard himself always went to where the fighting was the hardest. If there was a part of the battle where things were going poorly, Richard would go there. And not only would he go there, he'd get in the front and be fighting there in the front. And that would rally his men. The king's here with us. It got them going again. And that's the reason his formations and his offensives were always so effective, and his defensive formations too. Both. Imagine that. I mean, compare that to, say, okay, the Second Crusade, Louis VII of France. Louis VII of France was a terrible general, and when he was marching his army across Anatolia, at one point things got really tough, and he decided it was just too tough for him. So he got on a boat and made the rest of the trip via boat while he left his men to carry on this horrible march on their own. Now think about that. That is the kind of thing that demoralizes an army very quickly. That's the kind of thing Richard would never do. He refused to do that kind of thing. So yeah, his men loved him for that. He was personally a great warrior. And again, I mentioned this already, but he wouldn't play games with the lives of his men. So you think about the way he organized the march down the Palestinian coast. that led to the Battle of Arsuf. That was planned out in a way to keep his army intact and keep his men keep his men alive, quite frankly. And I think that's exactly why he wasn't willing to march on Jerusalem. He couldn't see a path to victory there. There were too many factors there he saw as that could lead to defeat. Meanwhile, other people in the army are just kind of mindlessly saying, no, we got to go on. Hugh of Burgundy and these various French nobles who are just like, yeah, let's just do it. Let's go to Jerusalem. Richard was too pragmatic for that. He just was. And the Templars and the Hospitallers were the ones who supported him in that. They were saying, we know this territory. We've been fighting here for decades. We understand exactly how this stuff goes. We know what it takes to hold Jerusalem. It's not the thing to do right now, And on top of that, a march on Jerusalem would have risked what they had already won at Saladin's expense so far, the control of the coast and all that stuff. So yeah, all of this, these qualities Richard had, they meant that his men followed him with this just total devotion. And one place we really see that is the Battle of Jaffa. The Battle of Jaffa is an incredible moment in the history of the Crusades, and it's a unique moment. I don't think there's anything quite like it, where Saladin has a very large army, which he has used to take control of Jaffa for the most part, except for the citadel. The Christian garrison is holed up in the citadel. And Richard and a handful of knights and crossbowmen storms the beach and drives Saladin's army off the beach. And it's just, why is he able to do this? One of the reasons he's able to do this is because his men are so tight with him. They are so willing to do this with him. As long as they've got him with them, they're willing to fight in a very dangerous situation. And one source that really makes this clear for us is the Muslim chronicler, Baha ad-Din. His name is actually Ibn Shaddad. Baha ad-Din was a title, but Saladin's chronicler, Ibn Shaddad, tells us that this small number of knights with the King of England just fought like lions that day with so much cohesion. Meanwhile, Saladin's troops didn't have that cohesion at that point, especially at that point. This is at the end of the Third Crusade. Their morale is down quite a bit. And I think Richard understood that. It's one of the reasons he knew that, and this was a calculated risk, I think most people would have never been willing to do this. Most commanders would have been like, Guy of Lusignan, who was willing to squander his army on the fields of Hattin. I think he would have looked at the situation and just been, too timid to do this kind of thing. But Richard understood. Again, he was very good at assessing the situation. He knew that Saladin's troops had a low morale at this point, and he knew that his guys could be relied upon to act, top notch, and they did. Read about the Battle of Jaffa or watch my video I did about it. It's just an incredible moment. But yeah, Richard was the kind of commander whose men were they were willing to go anywhere with him. And they were just willing to do what had to be done. And it was just, yeah, he was an incredible commander. So anyway, I just want to go over those reasons. This is it right there. This is exactly why Richard the Lionheart was the incredible general that he was. There's a couple of places you can go to get up to date on this. Here's 3 books. The Chronicle of the Third Crusade, which is one of our primary sources for the Third Crusade. It's called the Gesta Regis Ricardi. And there's a translation available done by the outstanding scholar Helen Nicholson. Read that. That gives you a really good idea of Richard's abilities. Also, the best biography on Richard, Richard the Lionheart by John Gillingham. Gillingham does a very good job of laying out Richard's skills as a general. And then there's another book that touches in a pretty detailed way on Richard's abilities, and that's The Art of Warfare in Western Europe During the Middle Ages by J.F. Verbruggen. Very good book. All kinds of good stuff just about medieval warfare in general in there. But that Verbruggen does make a point just to talk about Richard's abilities as a general. So anyway, just a quick little stream I wanted to give for you guys there. hope that answers the question. What was it exactly that made Richard the Lionheart such a great general? And I'll talk to you guys soon.